Mars Console Gamer. Hi everyone, there is a new big important update out for Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. The update is out now for consoles and PC. It's around 1.5 gigabytes on consoles. After a lot of negative reactions from the Space Marine 2 community on the last update, the developers took all your feedback to heart and decided to address it in this update. Here's what the developers have to say and all the fixes and improvements. Hi, Space Marines. As we discussed late last week, we've been monitoring your feedback since last Thursday's patch 4.0 and have decided to address your most pressing concerns with a new balancing update. Before we get to the details of the new patch, we want to thank you all for being so involved with the game and making your opinions heard. While we notice criticism with regards to difficulty adjustments, and rightly so, we'd also like to thank you for your very positive feedback on the new termination map. No matter the feedback, we're grateful that you feel so passionate about Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. The key takeaway for me, personally, is that I forgot that once the game comes out, it's no longer a dev's game. It's yours first and foremost. This is why, moving forward, we'd like to harness this energy by establishing public test servers. They would let you try out major balancing updates and make your voices heard before they are pushed onto public branches. We're hoping to make these available around early 2025, so stay tuned to our channels for more info. AI Director and Enemy Spawns. Here was our reasoning before patch 4.0. When the game came out in September, the Ruthless difficulty win rate hovered around 60%. Weeks later, and with the changes introduced by patch 3.0, we saw that the same win rate had jumped to over 80%, and we received a lot of feedback stating that the game had become too easy, even at its maximum difficulty at the time. With patch 4.0, our aim was to tweak enemy spawns to increase the overall number of enemies rather than reverting to buffing their health. Unfortunately, this had an impact on the easier difficulty levels as well. For example, the win rate on the easiest difficulty dropped slightly after patch 4.0, from 95% to 93%. This may not look like a lot, but numbers aren't everything. Your feedback made it clear that the game had become more intense and stressful on lower difficulties, and this was never our intention. As I've personally emphasized in interviews, Space Marine 2 is all about the power fantasy, and patch 4.0 negatively impacted it for many of you. This is why we're rolling back these changes. Extremist enemies' spawn rates in minimal, average, and substantial difficulties will revert back to their pre-patch 4.0 levels and will be significantly reduced in Ruthless difficulty to hopefully strike a balance between how hard the game was at launch and how easy it became with patch 3.0. Minimal, average, and substantial difficulties. Reduced spawn rate of extremist enemies to match pre-patch 4.0 levels. Ruthless difficulty, significantly reduced spawn rate of extremist enemies. Weapons, only in operations mode. We've been wanting to address the bolter family for a while, as they've been underperforming across all difficulty levels. This has been a frequent piece of feedback from many of you, and the data confirmed improvements were needed across the board. The percent damage increase is based on which classes have access to which kind of weapon and how the bolters compete with the other options available. Auto bolt rifle, damage increased by 20%. Bolt rifle, damage increased by 10%. Heavy bolt rifle, damage increased by 15%. Stalker bolt rifle, damage increased by 10%. Marksman bolt carbine, damage increased by 10%. Instigator bolt carbine, damage increased by 10%. Bolt sniper rifle, damage increased by 12.5%. Bolt carbine, damage increased by 15%. Oculus bolt carbine, damage increased by 15%. Heavy bolter, damage increased by 5%. Difficulty, Ruthless. Player's armor is increased by 10%. We are partially rolling back the change from the previous patch on Ruthless difficulty following your feedback. With patch 4.1, we're hoping to find the right compromise between how easy Ruthless difficulty felt after patch 3.0 and how it felt after last week's patch 4.0. The reason why it was reduced last week was that we noticed a very substantial bump in win rates on Ruthless after patch 3.0, as Minoris enemies would no longer remove the entire armor bar with their attacks. Ranged AI damage was nerfed across the board, and the ability to regenerate armor by parrying normal Minoris attacks was added. Additional note, despite the last patch notes listing a decrease in armor and substantial difficulty, this change was mistakenly left out of our last update, hence why you won't see it being reverted as part of this week's patch. Lethal, tight formation system is removed. Before anything else, let us clarify our reasoning for the introduction of this mechanic. As we worked on adding a new difficulty tier, we needed to make sure this new challenge was meaningful and interesting. With tight formation, our objective was to add a new layer of challenge for our most skilled players by adding horizontal progression rather than just vertical progression, dealing more damage to ever stronger enemies. This game is about the power fantasy, and enemies that take dozens of melee hits break it. Thus, the challenge needed to come from other sources. This system was also designed as a first step towards the introduction of gameplay modifiers down the line, both negative and positive, something World War Z players will be familiar with. But your feedback showed that the proximity requirements felt too restrictive. Classes like Assault and Vanguard felt especially penalized, as playing them effectively requires a certain freedom of movement. As a result, we're removing the system entirely and will continue to work on modifiers until they're ready. We will continue to monitor your feedback after the deployment of patch 4.1 to make sure lethal difficulty feels as challenging and rewarding as it should. AI. A recurrent piece of feedback we've seen is that the AI allies can feel useless at times. We already improved allies' behavior in patch 3.0, and we hope this additional buff will help solo players complete their operations. Bots deal 30% more damage to bosses. Fighting zoanthropes is often reported as a source of frustration. Alongside the changes to the AI director, we're taking away some of their shield's effectiveness to alleviate some of that frustration. Zoanthrope shield swap cooldown with another paired zoanthrope is increased by 10%. General fixes in tech. Fixed a bug that caused roll distance to be shorter than before. This was probably the most impactful and annoying consequence of patch 4.0. While iframes were the same, the distance difference made it much less effective versus ranged attacks. With this bug fixed, you should feel a great improvement in your fights against ranged enemies and bosses. Fixed bug with unlocking lethal difficulty rewards decals. Crash fixes and general stability improvements. Our teams are constantly working on improvements to the game's stability. This patch is no exception, so you should encounter fewer crashes. That's it for patch 4.1. Your feedback is absolutely invaluable to us, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this new update. The Emperor protects the Space Marine 2 team. Thanks for watching the video. Stay tuned for more updates on games, gameplay of new and older releases, console hardware, and various art.